Wang Changling, Song of the Border, number 1. Crickets chirp in the bare mulberry grove, in the 8th month, on the Xiao Pass road. We go beyond the pass, and then return. Nothing there but withered reeds and grasses. Troops sent from their homes to the inner plains grow old out here in this sandy waste. Pay no attention to those dashing cavalrymen, always bragging about their fabulous horses. Okay, so with this poem we start the relatively small section of poems that follows the first one in the book. These are 5-word old-style juefu. I already talked about the juefu in the video you have explaining the genres of Chinese poetry. Just to summarize, remember, juefu are basically ballads with populist and popular topics, and this is a perfect example. So the topic of this poem, as we will comment in a minute, is complaints of a soldier who is serving in the frontiers, fighting against the barbarians. Probably the title of this poem and the subject matter were imitated in the poems with the same title, in the juefu with the same title, that were written during the period of disunion. And I imagine that Wang Changling in this poem is also recreating both the subject matter and the tone of the original poem that he is imitating. And he has 2 songs of the border. The next one we will comment tomorrow. Another thing I'd like to say before we start talking about this poem specifically is about typecasting. So Wang Changling, we've already seen some poems of him. We will see more in the future, especially when we reach the 7-syllable long quatrain, which became something of his speciality. But poets in traditional China, basically through anthologies such as this one, tended to be typecast into a specific type of poetry. Now, Wang Changling wrote poems on very different subjects, but he, like Zhang Shen or like Gao Shi, would become typecast by poems such as the ones that we're going to talk about today and tomorrow as a frontier poet. That would be his forte. Representing images of serving in the army and of serving in the borders and the frontiers, and describing the alien landscapes of the barbarian lands of the steppe in the north and northwest. So, well, we must be critical with typecasting, but we must also take into account how these 2 poems, the one that we will talk about today and the one that we will talk about tomorrow, really really create a model of writing about the frontier and about the Chinese aesthetic appreciation of the frontier lands for future poems to come. So let's go on with this poem. It's pretty short. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 couplets, so 8 lines. So quite a short poem, but packed with lots of images. First couplet sets the scene. It sets the time and it sets the place. And it sets the time and place by explicitly mentioning the time and place, but also by an oral image that begins the poem. Crickets chirp in the bare mulberry grove, in the 8th month, on the Xiao Pass road. So in very ancient Chinese texts and poetry, the seasons were equated. There were more seasons. There were the 4 seasons that we have, but they had more months. They had double the number of months, 24 months in their calendar, and each of the months was equated with a natural phenomenon. And one of the autumn months was equated with crickets chirping. Now, in the translation here, cricket is the word used, but I suspect the animal is probably the Japanese semi, the cicada, which is like a very big bag that lives in the trees and that makes a deafening noise in summer and in autumn. So the crickets are chirping in the bare mulberry grove. Without saying anything, we know we're in autumn because the crickets are chirping, and we see a grove of mulberries that is leafless, bare. The leaves have fallen, so it's probably not just autumn, but well into autumn. And both images, the crickets chirping and the leafless trees, both already start to bring a a dark tone to the poem, yeah? A tone of emptiness, desolation, death, frigidness, emptiness. In the eighth month, on the Xiao Pass Road, so the second line that completes the couplet tells us we're in the eighth month, and more specifically, where are we? We are in the Xiao Pass Road. Now, where is the Xiao Pass Road? The center of the center west of China, the area where during the Tang and the previous dynasties the imperial capital was located, and where the old state of Qin had been located as well. This territory was known as the land within the passes, yeah? Wang, the land within the passes, because this area of western China was landlocked and surrounded by mountains, with a few mountain passes, which made it a region very easy to defend. One of its passes, the one to the north, was the Xiao Pass, and this led towards the barbarian lands. So, on the Xiao Pass Road, without any other information, we know that the poetic voice that is speaking in this poem is traveling towards the northwestern frontier of China, towards the barbarian lands of Central Asia, of the Taklamakan Desert, of Turkestan, of Outer Mongolia. Next couplet. We go beyond the pass and then return. Nothing there but withered reeds and grasses. So the troops, this is a song of the border, the troops that were traveling along the Xiao Pass Road go beyond it, that is, they make an incursion and or attempt to make some skirmishes in the barbarians' land beyond the pass. They go and come back. And the description of the alien landscape of the Northwest is synthesized in, again, an image of desolation. Nothing there but withered reeds and grasses. We already had an image of bareness in the bare mulberry grove, but this is a completely alien landscape. This is the steppe, very different from the Chinese heartland. The Chinese Empire in this historical period is basically the land surrounding the two great rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Jiangsu in the south. It's a land that is relatively wet, more in the south than in the north, with regular seasons, with trees and vegetation. Now, the land beyond the pale of Chinese rule, the land was a land of nomads. It was the nomadic East Asian steppe. Now, this is a land that has very little rainfall except in some seasons of the year, very few trees. It's basically a land of grasses, of vast extensions, vast plains with grasses. It's the eighth month, probably not the time of rain, and the land that is described is just a dry, bare, extended emptiness with only withered reeds and grasses. So no barbarians are in sight. Remember, they're nomads, so they can very easily escape and move around from a Chinese army. The only thing that was encountered was a desolate landscape, an alien landscape that is completely strange to the world of nature and the world of society of the Chinese soldiers who are marching there. Next couplet, and we move into the troops themselves. So we're going from the more generic, as usually happens in Chinese poems, we're going from a more generic description of the situation or of the views to a more human-centered, subjective and individualist point of view. The next couplet will talk us about the soldiers. Troops sent from their homes to the inner plains grow old out here in this sandy waste. So the troops from different parts of the empire, there was military conscription, military service was, during the Tang dynasty, there was an attempt, partially successful attempt at creating a professional army, but a levée and conscription was still, at least theoretically, obligatory for almost all male Chinese between certain ages. So the troops sent from their homes to the inner plains is the northern region of China, grow old out here in this sandy waste. So these troops have the curse of having to serve many years, growing old in this desolate landscape. Sandy waste. So there are deserts in the northwest region outside of China. The Taklamakan is nearby, going towards the Turkestan region. You also have big deserts, some of the worst deserts in the planet, the most desolate and dry. So in this wasteland with no vegetation, with only sand and withered plants, here is where the soldiers grow old and suffer. The last couplet is a warning, like saying, bearing this into account, seeing the reality of war here, don't be seduced by the fake romanticized vision of war that is usually publicized by, by the government, but also by some soldiers. Pay no attention to those dashing cavalrymen, always bragging about their fabulous horses. This seems to be a pretty universal image in the aesthetification of war. So, cavalrymen, not infantry, but most of the Chinese armies at this period are infantry armies. But the cavalry, until its disappearance in the 20th century, was generally considered an elite corps. In the Middle Ages, in fact, only noblemen could pay the very costly equipment and the horses for being cavalrymen. So cavalryman was a synonym of nobleman, of aristocrat in the Middle Ages. But even later, in modern and contemporary times, the cavalry corps of the armies have always been the elite and always the most showy, with fancy uniforms, riding horses, and they contributed to a romanticized view of what war was like, very different from the actual sordidness and pain and suffering and bloodiness and misery that war always represents. So here the poem ends with a warning: don't let yourself be seduced by these dashing, well-dressed, aristocratic cavalrymen telling you about their exploits. War is really about serving in an alien landscape for many years as you grow old and unhappy and miserable in a foreign land. So this is the poem, quite expressive. I would like to add one more piece of information. Chinese culture, this is a sweeping statement, a generalization, but I think we can defend it. Chinese society, the Chinese imperial world, has been defined almost from its origins by being a very civil society as opposed to a military-oriented society. In China, the values of civil rule, Wen, have always prevailed and been more respected than those of military power and government, Wu. Even in the oldest collections of Chinese poetry, in the Xijing, we find very few or no poems, as we do encounter in many other societies, praising warfare. We have no epic Chinese poem, and the poems about war in the Xijing are generally like the poem that we have just read. Complaints put in the mouths of soldiers who lament having to serve in faraway borders until they grow old and being far from their families. Chinese imperial society always saw in war as an evil, never as a good. That does not mean that the empire didn't have times of military expansion and glorification of military commanders, but the culture and the values of Chinese imperial society always put war as, in the best of cases, a necessary evil, and in the worst of cases, an unnecessary torture and evil, and something to be strictly censured. And this will appear in almost all the poems we will encounter about war. In this anthology or in others, you will see it, that war is an evil, and that the point of view is never or seldom ever the successful, handsome, epic warrior defeating the enemy. Most of the time, it's the soldiers who have to suffer and work hard and die in the frontiers. So this is a very interesting take, very different from a lot of European traditional poetry talking about war, starting with the Iliad and the Odyssey. So war is not idealized. The fact that these poems are written by scholar officials, representatives of civil government, who naturally distrust the commanders of the military administration, hammers in the point.